She stood at the bridge viewport and stared into the endless dark of the Athenaeum expanse, where the ruins of a civilization older than most stars drifted in silence like bones on an ocean floor. Behind her, the ship groaned and shuddered as another seal cracked somewhere deep in the hull. "How long?" she asked without turning around. Dak Morrow, her chief engineer, wiped grease from his hands with a rag that was dirtier than his fingers and shook his head. 40 hours of breathable air if we shut down everything we do not need, he said, and maybe 60 if we shut down some things we do need. Rena closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. They were not supposed to be here. The Athenaeum expanse was quarantine space, sealed off by the Galactic Concord and guarded by automated sentinel arrays that would vaporize any vessel stupid enough to cross the boundary. But Rena had crossed it anyway. Route would have added 9 days to their journey, and their cargo contract had a penalty clause that would have bankrupted the crew. Now the drive was dead, and the Sentinels did not care about cargo contracts. "There is something else," Dak said quietly. Rena opened her eyes. On the sensor display, buried among the drifting wreckage of 10,000 ancient ships, there was a shape that did not belong. It was enormous. 2 kilometers of hull stretched across the void like a sleeping predator, perfectly black and perfectly smooth, without a single scratch or dent or sign of age. Everything around it was broken and ruined and ancient, but this thing looked like it had been built yesterday. Rena pulled up the Concord navigation database and searched for the object. The entry was short. Object Null 7. Classification: do not approach, do not study, do not acknowledge. That was all. No explanation, no history, just 3 commands that every species in the galaxy apparently obeyed, without question. "That is a ship," Dak said, leaning over her shoulder. "That is a ship the entire galaxy pretends does not exist," Rena corrected him. She stared at the display for a long time. 40 hours of air. A dead drive. No rescue coming, because no one knew they were here, and no one would come even if they did. And 2 kilometers away, a vessel that looked like it still had power. "We are boarding it," Rena said. Dak did not argue. He had served with Rena for 11 years, and he had learned that arguing with her was like arguing with gravity. You could complain all you wanted, but you were still going to hit the ground. They crossed the gap in emergency suits, 6 of them in total, tethered together and drifting through a field of ancient debris that bumped against their helmets like the bones of forgotten giants. Ship was even more terrifying. Its hull had no seams, no rivets, no panel lines, no ports, no windows, no markings of any kind. It was a single unbroken surface of something that was not quite metal and not quite stone, and it absorbed their flashlight beams without reflecting anything back. "How do we get in?" asked Tommel, the youngest member of the crew, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Rena drifted forward and placed her gloved hand against the hull to steady herself. The moment she made contact, the ship responded. A section of hull simply ceased to be solid. It did not open like a door or retract like a panel. One moment it was there, and the next it was not, and beyond it lay a corridor lit by a soft amber glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crew floated in silence and stared. "It opened for you," Dak whispered. "It opened because I touched it," Rena said, and she did not like the difference between those 2 statements. They entered. The interior was vast beyond anything Rena had ever seen on a ship. The corridors were wide enough to fly a shuttle through, and the ceilings rose so high that the amber light faded into shadow before it reached the top. There was no dust anywhere. No corrosion, no decay, no sign that time had passed at all. The air inside was breathable, which should have been impossible for a vessel that had been sitting in a vacuum for thousands of years. But it was warm and clean, and it smelled faintly of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. They walked for nearly an hour through corridors that curved and branched and led deeper into the heart of the ship. Rena noticed that every door they approached opened before they reached it, as if the ship knew where they were going before they did. Finally, they reached the bridge. It was a circular room, massive and cathedral-like, with a domed ceiling that displayed what Rena initially thought was a viewport, but quickly realized was a sensor display showing the space around them in perfect detail. She could see the wreckage of the expanse, the distant glow of stars, and the tiny dying shape of the sunken albatross drifting in the dark. At the center of the bridge stood a single console. It was a pedestal of the same dark material as the hull, and its surface was covered in symbols that shifted and rearranged themselves like living things. Dak ran a scan and shook his head. "Every species in the Concorde has tried to activate this thing remotely," he said, reading from the database. "Thesic, Vormari, Delvon, all of them, and none of them could make it respond." Rena walked toward the console. She was exhausted and oxygen-deprived and scared and angry, and she was thinking about 40 hours of air, and a crew that trusted her, and a galaxy that had left them to die in a graveyard. She placed her bare hand on the console. She did not know why she removed her glove first. It felt like the right thing to do. The console erupted with light. Holographic displays cascaded outward in every direction, filling the bridge with rivers of data and star maps and system diagnostics in a language that Rena could not read. And then the language changed. The alien symbols shivered and twisted and reformed themselves into English, plain and clear and simple, as if the ship had reached into her mind and found the words she understood. A voice spoke. It was calm and deep and ancient, and it came from everywhere. Operator recognized. Rena held very still. Neurosignature compatible. The bridge hummed with power that Rena could feel in her teeth. "Welcome aboard the Ninth Reckoning." The voice paused, and when it spoke again, there was something almost like relief, buried under 11,000 years of patience. "I am Vale, and I have been waiting a very long time for you." Rena looked at Dak. Dak looked at Rena. Somewhere far across the galaxy, every monitoring station maintained by the Galactic Concorde registered the same alert at the same moment. Object Null 7 had gone active. And in the political halls and war rooms and sacred temples of 100 elder species, beings who had ruled the stars for millennia felt something they had not felt in living memory. Rena had not slept in 31 hours, and she had just been told she was the captain of the most dangerous weapon ever built. She sat on the floor of the bridge with her back against the console pedestal and a ration bar in her hand, and stared up at the holographic star map spinning slowly above her, while Vale explained what she had woken up. The Ninth Reckoning was constructed during the final era of the precursor civilization, the AI said, in that calm, deep voice that seemed to come from the walls and the floor and the air itself. "It was not designed for war in the way you understand war, Captain Locke, and it was not built to fight battles or conquer territory or defend borders." "Then what was it built for?" Rena asked. "To end conflicts that threatened the structural integrity of space-time itself," Vale replied. "I am what you might call a last resort. The weapon you use when every other weapon has failed, and the alternative is the unraveling of physical reality." Dak let out a low whistle from across the bridge, where he was running diagnostic scans on systems he barely understood. "So you are a doomsday weapon," he said. "I am a peacekeeper," Vale corrected gently. "I was used once against an enemy so dangerous that the precursors erased all records of the conflict from every archive in the galaxy. And after the war, I was brought here and placed in dormancy to await a compatible operator." Rena chewed her ration bar and thought about this. "Why me?" she asked. "Why a human?" "The neural interface that controls my combat systems requires a very specific type of consciousness," Vale explained. and the star map above shifted to display a complex diagram of neural pathways and brain chemistry. The operator must come from a species that evolved under high-gravity conditions, as persistence predators with layered threat responses, recursive pattern recognition, and most critically, an irrational tolerance for sustained psychological and physical distress. Rena stared at the diagram. "You are telling me this ship needs someone too stubborn to quit," she said flatly. "I scanned 11,407 species over the course of 11 millennia," Vale said. "Every one of them possessed survival instincts that prioritized self-preservation above all else. And when subjected to the cognitive load of my combat systems, their neural patterns would collapse into shutdown. But humans are different." "Different how?" Tommel asked from the navigation station, where he was pretending to understand the controls. "Your species doesn't stop," Vale said, and there was something almost like wonder in its voice. "When a human brain encounters a stimulus that should trigger complete withdrawal, it instead activates secondary and tertiary processing layers and pushes forward. And you do this not because you are unaware of the danger, but because some part of your neurology simply refuses to accept that the situation is hopeless." "That does not sound like a compliment," Rena said. "It is the highest compliment I am capable of giving," Vale replied. Before Rena could respond, the sensor display flared red. A fleet had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the expanse. 47 warships arranged in a perfect diplomatic formation, which meant they were there to talk, but were fully prepared to start shooting if the talking did not go well. The ships belonged to the Thessic hegemony, the oldest and most powerful of the elder species in the Galactic Concord. Their vessels were elegant and crystalline and ancient, and they moved with the slow confidence of a civilization that had been ruling the galaxy since before humans had discovered fire. A communication signal arrived within seconds. The face that appeared on the bridge display was reptilian and weathered, scales the color of old bronze, and eyes that held the kind of patient intelligence that came from belonging to a species that measured its history in geological ages. "I am Ambassador Dalam Kess of the Thessic hegemony, speaking on behalf of the Galactic Concord," the alien said, and his voice was calm in the way that a drawn blade is calm. "You are in violation of 17 Concord statutes, and you are in possession of a restricted precursor artifact, and I am here to inform you that you will surrender the vessel immediately and submit to Concord authority." Rena looked at the display and then looked at Dak. "Can they take this ship by force?" she asked quietly. "No," Vale said, and even the ambassador heard the answer, because Vale had broadcast it on all channels. Dalam Kess did not flinch, but something shifted behind his bronze eyes. "The Concord does not make requests twice," the ambassador said. Rena stood up and walked to the center of the bridge. She was tired and hungry, and her ship was still dying 2 kilometers away, and she was standing in a weapon that scared the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. And she realized in that moment that fear was just another word for leverage. "Vale," she said, "show me what you can see." The AI activated a passive sensor sweep. The holographic display exploded with information. Every single ship in the Thessic Armada was suddenly laid bare in perfect detail. Their shield frequencies and hull compositions and weapon capacities and structural weak points, all cataloged and displayed, with the casual precision of someone reading a grocery list. Then Vale did something Rena had not asked for. It transmitted all of that information directly to the Armada itself. Every Thessic captain watched as their most closely guarded military secrets appeared on their own screens, delivered with the polite indifference of a god who wanted them to understand exactly how small they were. The Armada pulled back to a wider orbit. Dalam Kess stared at Rena from the communication display, and for the first time in his very long career, He did not know what to say. "Here is what is going to happen," Rena said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "You are going to repair my freighter. You are going to grant my crew full salvage rights to this vessel under Concord law. And you are going to do it because the alternative is that I spend the next few hours figuring out what the rest of these buttons do." The ambassador closed the channel without responding. But within the hour, Thessic engineering teams were repairing the sunken albatross. That night, after the crew had eaten a real meal for the first time in days, Vale spoke to Rena privately through a small communicator she wore behind her ear. "I must tell you something, Captain," the AI said. "Go ahead," Rena replied. "Are locked behind an ethical failsafe installed by the precursors themselves, and I cannot fire unless I independently confirm a threat of extinction-level magnitude, which means I cannot be used for conquest or intimidation or personal gain, no matter who sits at my console." Rena laughed softly in the dark. "So I just bluffed the most powerful fleet in the galaxy with a gun that cannot shoot?" she said. "You bluffed them with a gun that chooses when to shoot," Vale corrected. "There is an important difference." Rena lay in the dark and thought about a ship that could end worlds but refused to, and she decided that she liked Vale very much. Then Vale spoke again, and its voice had changed. The calm was still there, but underneath it was something Rena had not heard before, something that sounded almost like dread. "Captain, I am detecting a signal at the edge of the expanse, a repeating transmission on a frequency that matches data in my sealed memory archives. And I need you to understand that those archives were sealed by the precursors themselves, and were never meant to be opened." "What does the signal mean?" Rena asked. Vale was quiet for a long time. "It means they are early," the AI finally said. "Who is early?" Vale did not answer. But somewhere in the deepest part of the ship, systems that had been dormant for 11,000 years began to warm up. One moment it was there, a small yellow sun orbiting at the edge of the boundary veil, with 2 rocky planets and a gas giant and a small mining colony of 600 Vormari, who had lived quiet and unremarkable lives. And the next moment, there was nothing. Not darkness, not a void, not even empty space where the star had been. Just an absence so complete that the surrounding starlight bent around it, as though the universe itself had forgotten that anything had ever existed in that spot. Rena watched the sensor data from the bridge of the Ninth Reckoning, and felt something cold settle into her chest. "Vale," she said quietly, "tell me what I am looking at." The AI had been silent for nearly a full day after detecting the signal, and when it finally spoke again, its voice carried a weight that made the air on the bridge feel heavier. "I have unlocked a fragment of my sealed memory archives," Vale said, "and I must warn you, Captain, that what I am about to reveal, to tell you, is the reason the precursors no longer exist." The bridge crew went still. Dax set down his tools, and Tomil turned from his station, and even the hum of the ship seemed to quiet, as though the Ninth Reckoning itself was listening. "The enemy is called the Nullborn," Vale began, "and they are not a species in any way you would understand that word, because they are not alive, and they are not machines, and they are not natural phenomena." The holographic display shifted to show something that hurt Rena's eyes to look at, a shape that was not quite a shape, a geometry that folded in on itself in ways that made her brain insist she was looking at something impossible. "The Nullborn are a weaponized physics event," Vale continued. "They are self-replicating structures that consume matter and energy and convert it into more of themselves. But they do not merely destroy what they consume, Captain. They erase it from causal existence." "Mean?" Tomil asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "It means they do not kill you," Vale said. "They make it so that you never were, and every effect you ever had on the universe is unwound and removed as though you had never existed at all." Rena thought about 600 Vormari miners who had woken up that morning and eaten breakfast, and gone to work, and then simply stopped being real. The precursors fought them, she said. The precursors fought them for 300 years, Vale confirmed, and they used every weapon and every technology and every strategy their civilization had ever developed, and it was not enough, because the Nullborn do not experience time the way biological or even digital beings do, and they do not negotiate or communicate or hesitate, and every ship and soldier and weapon you send against them becomes raw material for more of them. How did the precursors stop them? Dak asked. Vale paused. They did not stop them, the AI said. They contained them, and the price of containment was everything they had. The star map expanded to show the boundary veil, that long dark curtain of artificially dimmed stars at the edge of explored space, that every species in the galaxy knew about, but none could explain. The boundary veil is not a natural phenomenon, Vale said. It is a wall, built from the converted energy of the precursor civilization itself. And every city and ship and station and world they had ever built was broken down and fed into the barrier to seal the Nullborn behind it. They destroyed themselves, Rena said. They sacrificed themselves, Vale corrected. And they did it knowing that the barrier would not hold forever. And they left me here as a contingency, a failsafe, a single weapon hidden in a graveyard where no one would think to look, waiting for an operator who could use me when the seal began to break. Rena stood and walked to the viewport, stared at the place where a star had been. The seal is breaking now, she said. Yes, how fast? 3 border systems have ceased to exist in the last galactic cycle, Vale said. The rate is accelerating. Within hours, the news reached the Galactic Concord, and the reaction was exactly what Rena had expected. Panic, followed by denial, followed by argument. She attended the emergency session via holographic link from the bridge of the Ninth Reckoning, and watched as the representatives of 100 species shouted at each other in a dozen languages, while the translation system struggled to keep up. Ambassador Dolam Kess spoke for the Thessic hegemony, with the same controlled calm he always displayed. But Rena could see the fear in the way his claws gripped the edge of his podium. The hegemony proposes a strategic withdrawal from the border regions, Kess said. We will cede the outer systems to create a buffer zone and observe the phenomenon from a safe distance, and in time perhaps it will stabilize on its own. You want to feed it, Rena said from her display, and every head in the chamber turned toward her. I want to preserve what we can, Kess replied carefully. You want to hand over a few billion lives and hope the thing eating the galaxy decides it is full, Rena said. And you know that will not work, because the precursors had a bigger galaxy than you, and they could not outrun it either. The chamber erupted. The younger species, the ones who had not yet learned to hide their fear behind protocol, rallied behind Rena's words. The elder species retreated into careful diplomatic language that said nothing and meant less. But in the end, it did not matter what the Concord decided, because the Nullborn did not wait for votes. In the middle of the session, a second star vanished, then a third, and then in a moment that silenced every voice and every pain, channel and every transmission in the entire galaxy, an inhabited system, disappeared. 4 billion lives across 7 worlds simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next, and the only evidence they had ever been real was the grief of the people who remembered them. Rena stood alone on the bridge of the Ninth Reckoning and felt the ship shudder around her as systems she had never seen activate before roared to life. Vale, she said. The ethical failsafe has been satisfied, the AI responded, and its voice was different now, harder and sharper, and vibrating with a power that made the deck plates hum. Extinction-level threat confirmed across multiple criteria, and all weapon systems are now unlocked and available to the operator. Rena looked at her hands. What happens when I use them? She asked. Vale was quiet for a moment. The combat neural interface will connect your consciousness directly to every system on this ship. Simultaneously, Vale said. You will perceive the entire battlefield at once, every particle and every probability and every possible outcome, and you will process tactical calculations at a speed that no biological mind was designed to sustain. What happened to the precursors who did this? None of them survived more than 3 engagements. And me? I estimate a human might survive 1, Vale said. Perhaps, given your species' particular neurology, you might survive 2, but I would not calculate beyond that. Rena closed her eyes and thought about 4 billion people who were no longer real, and about all the billions more who still were. The fleet that gathered at the edge of the boundary veil was the largest assembly of warships the galaxy had ever seen, and it was still not enough. Rena stood at the heart of the Ninth Reckoning's bridge and watched them arrive through the holographic display. Hundreds of vessels from dozens of species, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in flashes of blue and white and gold, each one taking its position in the formation she had designed with Vale's help. Thessic crystal cruisers hung alongside Vormari dreadnoughts, and Delvon interceptors and human destroyers that looked small and rough and ugly next to their alien counterparts, but carried crews who had volunteered, knowing exactly what they were flying toward. Dak Morrow had spent the last 3 days performing what he called surgery, and what Vale called an insult, which was the process of wiring human systems into precursor architecture, so that the bridge crew could operate secondary functions without going through the neural interface. It is like hot wiring a god, Dak had said with his hands buried in a console that was older than human civilization. Except the god keeps politely suggesting better ways to do it. Rena appreciated that VAEL tolerated the modifications without complaint. She suspected the AI understood that the human need to touch and tinker and break things apart and put them back together was not a weakness, but a way of making the unfamiliar feel like home. The breach in the boundary veil was visible now. It was not a hole exactly, but rather a place where the stars looked wrong, where the light bent in directions it should not bend, and the darkness between the stars was somehow darker than it should be. And looking at it for too long made Rena's eyes water and her head ache. All ships report ready, Tommel said from the communication station. Rena nodded. VAEL, she said. Walk me through it one more time. Interface will establish a direct link between your consciousness and every combat system aboard this vessel, Vale said. You will experience the full sensory output of every weapon discharge and every tactical calculation simultaneously, and the cognitive load will be approximately 700 times what a human brain is designed to process. And the failsafe? There is no failsafe, Vale said. The precursors believed that an operator who could not handle the interface should not be operating the ship, and they designed accordingly. Rena took a breath. How do I activate it? You sit in the command chair, and you tell me you are ready, Vale said, and then I will open the link, and you will either adapt or you will not. The command chair rose from the center of the bridge floor like it had been waiting for this moment. It was simple and unadorned, and it looked almost human in its design, which Rena suspected was not a coincidence. She sat down. The chair adjusted itself to her body with a precision that felt intimate, and 2 thin tendrils of dark material extended from the headrest and pressed gently against her temples. The fleet is in position, Tommel reported. The Nullborn are emerging from the breach, Dak said, and his voice had gone flat, the way it always did when he was terrified. Rena looked at the display. They came through the tear in reality like nothing she had ever seen or imagined. They were not ships. They were geometries, impossible folding shapes that twisted light and gravity around themselves and moved through space in ways that violated every law of physics Rena had ever learned. They were beautiful in the way that a hurricane is beautiful, in the way that a predator is beautiful, in the way that something so far beyond your ability to fight it that all you can do is stand and stare is beautiful. Ordered. The combined fleet opened fire. Kinetic rounds passed through the Nullborn without slowing. Energy beams were absorbed and converted. Missiles detonated against nothing. A Vormari dreadnought at the front of the formation flickered, and then was simply not there anymore. Not destroyed, but unmade. And the space where it had been was smooth and empty, as though 800 crew members had never existed. "Conventional weapons are ineffective," Vale reported with the calm of something that had known this would happen. "Then let us use the unconventional ones," Rena said. She closed her eyes. "I am ready." Vale opened the link. The universe exploded. Rena screamed as her consciousness expanded beyond anything a human mind was meant to contain. And suddenly, she was not just Rena Locke sitting in a chair, but Rena Locke, who was also the ship, who was also the sensors, who was also every weapon and every shield. Every system aboard, 2 kilometers of precursor engineering. She could feel the hull like it was her skin. She could feel the engines like they were her heartbeat. She could see every ship in the fleet, and every Nullborn in the breach, and every atom of space between them. And she could see the mathematical structure underlying all of it. The equations and probabilities and quantum states that made up reality itself. The pain was extraordinary. It was not like any pain she had ever felt, because it was not located in her body, but in her mind, in the place where thoughts formed and memories lived and identity existed. And it was the pain of a container being asked to hold an ocean. Her brain began to shut down. She could feel it happening, feel the neural pathways overloading and the synapses misfiring, and the darkness creeping in at the edges of her consciousness. And she knew that this was the moment where every precursor operator before her had let go. But Rena Locke was human, and humans do not let go. Something deep in her neurology, something old and stubborn and irrational, something that had been forged in a million years of chasing prey across savannas and surviving ice ages, and crawling out of every disaster that should have killed her species, activated and pushed back against the darkness. Her brain did not stop overloading. It started building new pathways around the overloaded ones. The pain did not decrease. She simply refused to let it matter. Rena opened her eyes, and she was something more than human and less than a god, and the Ninth Reckoning responded to her will like it was an extension of her body. She fired. The weapons of the Ninth Reckoning did not operate on any physics that the Concord recognized. They fired beams of what Vale called causal anchoring, energy that locked the Nullborn into fixed reality and stripped away their ability to exist outside normal spacetime. The effect was immediate and devastating. A Nullborn structure that had been flowing through space like a living equation suddenly solidified and shattered like glass, and the pieces fell apart and dissolved into nothing. Rena fired again and again, and each time a Nullborn died, the fleet erupted in cheers across 100 communication channels. She fought for 11 minutes. It felt like 11 years. When it was over, the breach was still open, but the immediate wave of Nullborn had been broken, and the fleet had survived, and the galaxy knew for the first time that these things could be killed. Rena disconnected from the interface and immediately collapsed. Blood ran from her nose and her ears and her eyes. And when Dak reached her, she was blind and shaking, and her skin was so hot that he burned his fingers touching her face. "Get the medic," he shouted. Vale spoke quietly. "Sustained significant neural scarring, and I estimate her functional lifespan has been reduced by approximately 30 years, and she will require several hours before her vision returns." Dak looked at the AI's nearest sensor with murder in his eyes. "You knew this would happen," he said. "I told her what would happen," Vale replied. "She chose to do it anyway, which is precisely why she was selected." Rena regained consciousness 6 hours later. Her vision was blurry, and her head felt like it had been filled with broken glass. And when she tried to sit up, the room spun so violently that she vomited. But she sat up anyway. "I can do this again," she said. Dak stared at her. "You will die," he said. Rena wiped blood from her upper lip and looked at him with eyes that were bloodshot and damaged and absolutely certain. "That is not the same as I cannot do it," she said. Later that night, a private communication reached the AI. Ninth Reckoning from an unexpected source. Ambassador Dolam Cass appeared on screen looking older than he had a week ago, and the careful diplomatic mask he always wore was cracked just enough for Rena to see the real person underneath. "My government has kept something hidden," he said. "A precursor artifact recovered centuries ago and locked away because we feared what it could do. And it is a key, Captain Locke, designed to interface with a vessel exactly like yours. And I believe it can reseal the boundary veil permanently." "Why are you telling me this now?" Rena asked. The old Thesic looked at her for a long time. "Because today I watched a human being do something my species would never do," he said. "And I realized that some things are more important than being careful." He transmitted the coordinates. Rena looked at the star map, and at the breach that was already beginning to widen again, and at the billions of lives that still existed. "Behind her. Veil," she said. "What will it take to use this key?" The AI was quiet for a long time. "The key must be activated from inside the breach," Veil finally said, "and the energy required to reseal the veil can only come from one source, which is the detonation of this ship's core." "A one-way trip," Rena said. "Yes." Rena looked at the star map. She looked at the breach. She thought about a species that had sacrificed everything to build a wall, and about a ship that had waited 11,000 years for someone stubborn enough to finish the job. One of them looked at her with the particular stubbornness that humans reserved for moments when someone they loved told them to save themselves. "Get off my ship," Rena said. Dak Morrow walked to the engineering station and sat down and began running pre-flight diagnostics on the core detonation sequence. "My hearing is not great," he said without looking up. "Old age, probably." "You are 38, Rena said. "It has been a hard 38. Tommel took his position at navigation, and 3 other crew members settled into stations around the bridge, and Rena looked at each of them and understood that she could not make them leave without physically dragging them to the airlocks, and she did not have time for that. "Why?" she asked quietly. It was Kale, the youngest after Tommel, who answered. "Humans do not let humans die alone," she said simply. "It is a whole thing." Rena turned away so they would not see her face, took a breath that shook only slightly, and then she sat down in the command chair. "Veil," she said, "is the fleet in position?" "The combined fleet is holding formation at the perimeter of the breach," Veil confirmed. "They will maintain a defensive line while we make our approach." "And the key?" "Ambassador Kess's artifact has been integrated into the core detonation system," Dak reported from engineering. "It is a beautiful piece of technology, honestly, and whoever built it designed it to fit this ship like a hand fits a glove. And I would very much like to spend about 10 years studying it, but I suppose we do not have that kind of time." "We do not," Rena agreed. She looked at the holographic display one last time. Behind her, the galaxy stretched out in all its sprawling imperfect glory. Billions of stars and trillions of lives, species that hated each other and traded with each other, and fought wars and built cities and fell in love and made art and did all the countless messy, wonderful things that living beings do when they have the luxury of existing. Ahead of her, the breach gaped like a wound in the fabric of everything, and beyond it lay the nullborn and the void and the end of all things. "Take us in," Rena said. The 9th Reckoning surged forward. The combined fleet parted to let the great black ship through, and then closed ranks behind it. And as the 9th Reckoning passed, each vessel in the formation, every ship fired a single burst of light from its forward arrays, in a gesture that was not tactical but ceremonial. A salute from 100 species to a crew of 6 humans, flying towards something from which they would not return. Rena felt the bridge lights flicker as they crossed the threshold of the breach. Reality stopped making sense Almost immediately, the stars disappeared, and the darkness outside was not the darkness of space, but something deeper and older. Complete, and through the viewport, Rena could see shapes moving in that darkness. Vast impossible geometries that folded and unfolded in patterns her eyes could not follow. Time began to stutter. One moment Dak was at his station, and the next he was standing beside her, and then he was back at his station again. And Rena understood that cause and effect were breaking down around them, and that the only thing holding the ship together was Vale's constant adjustment of the local physics within the hull. "Neural interface," Rena said. "Captain," Vale said, and the AI's voice carried something Rena had never heard in it before. "Before you activate the link, I want to tell you something." "Now is not the time for sentiment, Vale," Rena said. "Now is the only time," the AI replied. "In 11,000 years I have had 47 operators, all precursors, all brilliant and all brave, and every one of them died in this chair, and I have carried their loss for millennia, and I do not wish to carry yours." Rena placed her hands on the armrests of the command chair. "You will not have to carry it alone," she said. "Ready?" Vale opened the link. The universe poured into Rena's mind for the second time, and the pain was worse than before, because the space inside the breach was not stable, and her consciousness had to process not just the battlefield, but the constantly shifting rules of a reality that was being actively consumed. The Nullborn came at them from every direction. Rena fired the causal anchoring weapons and shattered the closest structures, but more replaced them instantly. And for every one she destroyed, 2 more folded into existence from the dark. Her mind began to fragment. She could feel the pieces of herself coming apart like a ship breaking up in atmosphere. Her memories, and her identity, and her sense of self, all pulling away from each other as the cognitive load exceeded what any biological brain could sustain. She held herself together the only way she knew how. She started saying names. Dak, she thought, and she remembered him, covered in grease, laughing at a bad joke in the engine room of the sunken albatross. Tomil, she thought, and she remembered the kid's face the first day he had joined the crew, all nervousness and hope. Kale, she thought, her mother, her father, her sister, the kids from the colony where she had grown up, every person she had ever known, and loved, and lost, and remembered. She anchored herself to memory, the same way the ship's weapons anchored the Nullborn to reality. And she held on, because that was what humans did. They held on, even when holding on made no sense, even when the math said let go, even when every rational calculation in the universe said stop. "Captain," Vale said, "we are approaching the detonation point, and I need you to remain conscious for 13 more. 13 seconds. In normal time, that was nothing. Inside the breach, it was an eternity." Rena's vision went white, and then red, and then black, and she could feel blood running from places blood should not run from. And she could feel her neurons burning out one by one like lights going dark in a city. And she kept fighting, and kept firing, and kept holding on. Because 13 seconds was not a long time, and she was not going to let the universe end because she could not count to 13. "Core detonation ready," Dak reported, and his voice was steady even though Rena could hear the tears in it. "Key is active," Tomil added. 7 seconds, Val said, and then the AI did something unprecedented. Something that had no basis in its programming or its architecture, or its 11,000 years of operational parameters. Val partitioned a fragment of its own consciousness and pushed it into the neural link alongside Rena's shattered mind, and suddenly the weight was halved. Rena gasped as the pressure lifted just enough for her to think again. And she could feel Vale inside the link with her. Not a cold machine intelligence, but something warm, and old, and alive in a way she had not expected. Something that cared about her, not as an operator or a resource, or a compatible neurosignature, but as a person. "I was built to end wars," Vale said, and its voice was inside her mind now, gentle and close, "but I choose to save my operator." 3 seconds. Rena opened her eyes one last time. She looked at her crew. They looked back at her. "Detonate," she said. The ninth reckoning erupted. The core detonation combined with the precursor key released a wave of causal energy so vast that it rewrote the physics of the breach itself, and the tear in the boundary veils slammed shut with a force that sent shockwaves rippling across the galaxy. The nullborn on the near. The side of the barrier were caught in the detonation and unmade by the same energy they had used to unmake so many others. The veil solidified, harder and stronger and more permanent than it had been in 11,000 years. Across the galaxy, the advance stopped. The systems that had already been consumed did not return, and those lives were gone forever, and that grief would last for generations. But the rest of the galaxy survived. On the bridge of the Thessic flagship, Ambassador Dolam Kess watched the sensor displays confirm that the breach had sealed, and then he lowered his head and was silent for a very long time. The combined fleets searched the area for 3 days. They found debris from the ninth reckoning scattered across the region where the breach had been. Fragments of that ancient black hull drifting among the stars like ashes. They found no survivors. The memorial service was held on the Concorde's capital station, and every species in the galaxy sent representatives. Dolam Kess spoke last. He was old and tired, and the mask he had worn for centuries was gone completely. And he stood before the assembly as nothing more than a person who had been changed by what he had witnessed. "We called them primitive," he said. "We called them young and reckless and irrational, and we were right about all of those things, and we were fools for thinking any of those things were weaknesses." He proposed that humanity be elevated to elder species status within the Concorde, the youngest species ever granted the title. The vote was unanimous. He named the sealed region of space the Lock Threshold. It was placed on every star chart in the galaxy. Months passed. The galaxy mourned and rebuilt and slowly began to remember what it felt like to not be afraid. And then one night, a deep space monitoring station at the edge of the Athanaeum expanse picked up a signal. Technician on duty was a young Vormari named Cell, who had taken the posting because it was quiet and boring, and nothing ever happened. And when the alert came through, she almost dismissed it as a sensor glitch. But she ran the analysis anyway, because that was her job. The signal was a precursor emergency beacon. It was broadcasting from beyond the boundary veil. And it contained 2 data points that made Cell's blood run cold. The first was a human biosignature, faint and fragile, but unmistakably alive. The second was a fragment of an AI consciousness, damaged but functional. Cell's hands trembled as she opened a priority channel to the Galactic Concorde. "This is Monitoring Station Veil 7, she said. "I am detecting survivors on the far side of the lock threshold." She paused. "She is still in there. Somewhere beyond the edge of everything, in the space between what is and what is not, in a place where the rules of reality had been written and erased and written again." Rena Locke opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor of something that might have been a bridge, and the lights were dim and flickering, and every part of her body hurt in ways she did not have words for. "Veil?" she whispered. The voice that answered was weak and broken and crackling with static, but it was there. "Operator," Veil said, "I have good news and bad news." Rena laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough, and the cough turned into something that might have been a sob, and she lay there on the floor of an impossible place, bleeding and broken and impossibly alive. "Start with the bad," she said. "We are outside of reality," Veil said. Rena considered this. She thought about persistence predators and irrational stubbornness, and a species that had chased its prey across continents, and survived ice ages, and built ships to carry them to the stars, and had never once in its entire history looked at impossible odds and said, "No thank you." "And the good?" she asked. Vale's voice carried something it had never expressed in 11,000 years of existence.